All right, recording and transcription has begun. So I want to welcome everybody to today's session of MidDay Café Live. My name is Mike Giannotti, and we're going to begin in just a moment. I see we continue to have people starting up, and I'll keep admitting you, but a couple of housekeeping items before we begin today's session on addressing Kari's Law and Ray Baum's Act with Microsoft Teams phone system. You'll note that there is a chat dialogue. So everybody coming in is muted. However, we do have a chat dialogue, which will allow you to ask questions. I'll be monitoring that. I'll be actually disappearing here, fading off into the background visibly. But we will, I'll be able to queue those up. Helen will be looking at those. And if you have questions, type them. We can always bring people off mute so that you can orally ask, or you can say, hey, I have a question about the following, and we can just address it during the session. So feel free to do that. Also, just as an FYI, starting next week, for next week's session and moving forward, we're going to have the exact same link. So instead of I'll have individual invites for MidDay Café Live on LinkedIn, but they're all going to reference just a recurring meeting. That way it will make it a little easier than publishing a unique link each and every week. We'll just keep a track history moving forward. So I think that'll simplify things for people. You'll actually be able to mark it, add it to your calendar once, and then you can tune into the sessions that you want as we move forward. But we're going to continue to do live sessions with great speakers like today's. So without further ado, I will fade into the background, and Helen, the show is yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Michael. Don't be shy, everyone. My name is Helen, and I am a Teams technical specialist in the health HLS organization. And as Michael was saying, today we are addressing Kari's Law and Ray Baum's Act with Microsoft Teams systems. As more and more customers are implementing and transitioning to Teams Voice, we will need to make sure everyone is in compliance. So Kari's Laws and Ray Baum's Act. If you haven't heard, this law was implemented on January 6, 2022, but MidDay Café was so popular that we didn't get on the queue until today, 1 month later. So here we are today discussing Kari's Law and Ray Baum's Act, and feel free to read through the legislation, which is 66 pages long, but I can also simplify it in 3 bullet points for you here as well. What it is on-site personnel needs to be available for direct emergency calling and dialing notifications. And then multi-line phone system, which needs to be configured to support emergency service calling, dialing 911 now. So no need for the number 9 anymore. You can directly call out with 911 instead of 9 and then 911 to emergency services. And lastly, Ray Baum's Act is really making sure that location is identified, so that dispatch knows exactly where you are, so they can actually go to where you're located and help the people that are in need. Now, what are those options? What are those options with Microsoft Teams? I will hand it over to my colleagues, JW and Chad, to talk about those.
Yeah, hello everyone. Chad Stout, Teams Technical Specialist. Been around Microsoft for quite some time. You may or may not know, right? Microsoft Teams phone system is a pretty flexible license and allows you to connect to the PSTN through 3 different modalities, right? So number 1 is direct routing, and those are for customers who have kind of a sunk cost in on-premises phone system hardware, have a great relationship with their domestic, long distance, and international calling plan operator, maybe negotiated some pretty sweet rates with folks like AT&T, Verizon, Lumen, etc. They may have some use cases in HLS or health and life sciences, especially in the provider space, we have use cases driving the need for resiliency across physical sites. Operator Connect is another option, makes things a little bit easier from a management perspective. Operator Connect is, again, leveraging kind of your great relationship with an existing operator of choice, where you may have negotiated great prices, but you don't necessarily want to manage the on-premises kind of SBC hardware, session border controller hardware, session survivable branch appliances, for example. You don't want to manage that stuff on site. You want your operator to manage that for you. Operator Connect is a great option. And then finally, Microsoft calling plans. While they can be more expensive, there's a lot of value there, right? And Jason will be talking through some of that value with regards to managing emergency calling. But the Microsoft calling plans are really for customers supporting knowledge and frontline workers in hybrid and remote work scenarios. Really, it's for customers kind of looking to get out of the business of supporting phone system and realize that by eliminating activities related to kind of planning, configuration, deployment, upgrading, and ongoing management, they get value out of that. So I'm going to throw it over to Jason, and Jason's going to talk a little bit about managing emergency calling.
All right. So Jason Workentine, I'm a Microsoft Teams technical specialist. I work with both Helen and Chad as well. So when we look at this here, we look at a level of complexity. We have direct routing, Operator Connect, and Microsoft calling plans, as Chad has discussed. We go into level of complexity, first with direct routing. Registered emergency addresses are not supported, and you must ensure that there is a online voice route for the emergency dial string in the emergency call routing policy. Now, specifically, those two bullets will address Kari's law. And then you must have an emergency calling policies for users through Teams for call routing policies to define numbers and associated routing destinations. And you must assign an emergency call routing policy to that user network or both. And as it relates to Baum's Act, those two are specific. Then we get into Operator Connect. The complexity goes down a little bit, and Chad had mentioned a little bit on that as well. Assigned telephone numbers have a required emergency address or requested, depending on the capabilities assigned to the number when the carrier uploads that information into their inventory. They must be configured and enabled for dynamic emergency calling, and they're automatically enabled for emergency calling by default. Now we go to the simplest, the Microsoft calling plans. And Chad had mentioned that they are a little bit more expensive, but there is a lot of benefit to them. It's the most simplest. They're automatic. The numbers themselves automatically have a registered emergency number or address. And they're automatically enabled for emergency calling. And they're also automatically enabled for emergency dynamic calling as well. So we can get into more specifics as well, if we like. Chad, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, sure thing, Jason. Let's talk about call routing from an emergency call perspective.
Yeah, call routing directly. I mean, to get into more specifics, we have direct routing. Like I said earlier in the presentation, there is some complexity there. If an emergency call routing policy is associated with the site, then the site policy is used to configure the emergency calling. The next bullet that we have is a little bit more complex. It is a little wordy. I'm going to go through here. If there's no emergency call routing policy associated with the site, if the client is connected to an undefined site, or if the dial number does not match any of the emergency numbers defined in the emergency call routing policy associated with the site, then the emergency call routing policy associated with the user's account is used to configure the emergency calling. So yeah, it is a mouthful. I will
So
say.
time out, Jason, real quick. That one is a mouthful. I start laughing because it's a lot. Just for clarification purposes, that second bullet point is a little confusing, right?
Yeah.
So if a new site comes online and I don't have an emergency call routing policy associated with that site, it'll default to the emergency call routing policy assigned to the user.
Yeah, that is correct. I mean, so if you become incapacitated, you can't talk, something happens, and you do dial an emergency number, they will see that and be able to go back to the user's defined policy and be able to route it to the correct location.
And then to the third bullet point, right? If I have no emergency call routing policy assigned at the site level or the user level, right?
Well, and then at that point, the user's not enabled for emergency calling at that point.
Got it. Yep.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So, I mean, there is some complexity there. There's a lot of thought that needs to be put into this.
So make sure you get your addresses in.
Operator connects in the middle there, you know, as far as complexity. It does rely heavily on the carrier itself. If a Teams client for the United States is dynamically acquires an emergency address within the United States. So the address is then used for emergency routing instead of the registered address. And the call will be automatically routed to the PSAP in the serving address area. And PSAP is the public safety answering point, specifically in the US.
And that's a little different in countries outside the US where we're offering calling plans, right, Jason?
Right. And instead of sending it to the PSAP, we will send it to the specific country's emergency provider. And then if we have a Teams client for the United States, if the user doesn't dynamically acquire an emergency address, then the registered emergency address is used to help screen and route the call. However, the call will be screened to determine if the updated address is required before connecting the caller to the appropriate PSAP. Make sense? And then to get in specific, now this is the overall, you know, easy button. Essentially, when we assign a number, whether it's a new number or ported number, the dynamic as well as the emergency calling is automatically registered. So if a Teams client is located in a tenant-defined emergency location, emergency calls from that client are automatically routed to the PSAP, serving that particular specific geographic location. If a team client is not located in a tenant-defined emergency location, emergency calls from that client are screened by a national call center to determine the location of the caller before transferring that call to the PSAP, serving that specific location. And last but not least, if an emergency caller is unable to update their emergency location to the screening center, the call will be transferred to the PSAP, serving that caller's registered address. So, I mean, overall, this is the easy button. You go in here, and a lot of this is taken care of beforehand.
So let me stop you there. I'm looking at the third bullet point, and I'm trying to think of a scenario. So that third bullet point is referring to a scenario where I'm kidnapped from my Microsoft Office by Google operatives, and I managed to dial 911, but I can't talk.
Right. I mean, so try not to get kidnapped. But so what happens is that the user's information will be transferred or sent to the appropriate location or PSAP based upon the address that is registered to that phone number. So very simple. Very simple. So Chad, I will say that we do have a lot of customers right now that are going through this process. And from my understanding, you actually have a couple customers or one specifically that we can, you know, maybe provide a couple examples for.
Yeah, no, great call out, Jason. I am currently working with a large strategic provider in healthcare. They were an early adopter of Teams for chat, collaboration, and meetings. They saw really a growing trend to include phone system capabilities within the flow of work. Kind of a groundswell effort, really accelerated by information workers working remotely and clinical workers roaming from location to location. As we all know, clinical workers are kind of strapped. There's not many of them around for the kind of demand we're experiencing or have experienced over the last couple of years. And they're roaming from location to location using mobile devices like iOS and Android. Also, obviously, right, the since passed January 6th, 2022 deadline pushed this organization to comply with Kari's Law and Ray Baums Act. Their use case really focused on remote and on-premises clinical frontline workers that had a need to comply with Kari's Law, Ray Baums Act. And in some cases, right, they've chosen to use the easy button. They're leveraging the flexibility of the Microsoft Teams phone system license for PSTN connectivity to support remote information workers through Microsoft calling plans. Quite frankly, I think a lot of those remote information workers don't even really make too many outbound calls, right? But they needed to comply with the emergency call routing aspects of Kari's Law and Ray Baums Act. And then the frontline workers, they're using direct routing. Direct routing is supported at the site level using really redundant SBCs, in this case Cisco, and PSTN circuits provided by their operator of choice, which is Verizon. Remember, Microsoft calling plans, they include the assigned telephone number that is a registered emergency address. It has, right, phone numbers. We offer phone numbers that are automatically enabled for emergency calling. And really, at the end of the day, you assign or you port the existing number, and you're compliant with Kari's Ray Baums Act automatically from a calling plan perspective. Direct routing obviously requires a little more care and feeding. You mentioned some of that around emergency calling. There's a little bit more care and feeding on premises with regards to configuring, upgrading, and managing, right, that SBC, SBA infrastructure. Unfortunately, right, registered emergency addresses are not supported for direct routing. So you've got to do a few things that you mentioned earlier. I kind of see it. You pointed out pretty nicely there in your first slide, Jason, where you've got the arrow around level of complexity. If you need an easy button, you need it to happen fast. Some customers do. In some cases, they just don't have they've got resource constraints. They've got timing constraints. They've got demands from their different subsections of information and kind of first line workers. And then obviously they have different scenarios within those two constructs. But they've used the Teams calling plan feature as a way to accelerate their deployment and include everyone while they're in parallel working on the more complex type emergency calling configuration for those on-premises frontline clinical workers. To date, they've successfully transitioned, I think, over 16,000 users. They're on track to complete the transition to over 32,000 users by the end of June. That's another thing that's pretty nice, right? You can accelerate your deployment, and a lot of customers outside of this customer in particular are experiencing that. One thing that stuck with me, through the first few rounds of transitioning, 500 to 1,000 users to Microsoft phone system, the customer said, I wish I would have considered this transition earlier. Microsoft's getting out of the phone business, or making getting out of the phone system business easier than we ever thought. I thought that,
Interesting.
that was something that, kind of said a lot. I wish I could have recorded that or got them on video to share that with the rest of the world. But unfortunately, I have not. I'll be looking to do that sometime here in the near future.
Well, we're sharing it now. We do have some questions before we get into our next slide. Rod, you raised your hand first. Why don't you start first? Rod Harrison. Okay, I'll jump to the next person, Kurt.
You have to you want me to unmute them? They're on mute.
Let's go back to Rod.
Yeah, let's go back to Rod. And
Okay, Rod, do you want to try unmuting one more time?
I can do it. I'll do it.
I think I just.
There we
You
go.
just did it. Good. There you go.
There we go. Thank you for taking my question.
Sure
So
thing.
if I
Yeah.
can back up for 1 second to your kidnapping scenario, right? In that scenario, the person being kidnapped is in the trunk of a car heading down the highway, at which their location obviously is not their registered address. In the event, as you mentioned, you cannot change your address to your current location, and your team's client sends your registered address, does that meet the Karis law and the Baum Act? Is sending that registered corporate address as the caller's location? Is that what you're saying? Is that meets that compliance?
So from an implementation perspective, that meets the guidance, right, from a Karis law perspective. Actually, it's more of a Baums Act, right, requirement. So essentially, it's a great example of me not being at that registered address, right? The other thing that we can do, and something that we haven't mentioned, right, or actually I think it was mentioned by Helen at the beginning, right? We can notify, right, on-site personnel that an emergency phone number has been dialed, right, from my registered address. And so they could go investigate and start to understand, hey, why is Chad not in his office? Right? An emergency call has kind of taken place, but why isn't he why is he not in his office?
Well, in today's environment of a ton of hybrid workers, I work for a university.
Yeah.
We find that the majority of our people today are not in their registered office locations.
That's right.
And we cannot manage users that are either working from home on a laptop or in their car on their cell phone, with their Teams app on their cell phone. I mean, people are all over the place.
That's
so
correct. Yeah.
We're a bit befuddled with how to meet this law when people rarely are going to be in one location like we were pre-pandemic.
Yeah. And so the easy button is, of course, the calling plans, right? You assign the number or you port the number because it's, special to that person or whatever. That's the easy button, right? You get dynamic E911. It's just all out of the box with Microsoft calling plans.
That's what we have. We all have calling plans, and that's my scenario that I'm saying we struggle with, is that with those calling plans, people are all over geographic locations from day to day, hour to hour.
Right. So your dynamic E911 should take care of that. Right. Based on, they've got location services enabled on their laptops, right? Or they've got
I got you.
Location services enabled on an iOS or an Android device, then we're in good shape, right?
Okay. And is that something?
And we can, and quite frankly,
at the tenant.
I'm sorry. Yes. So quite frankly, Rod, right? We can still accommodate for that in a direct routing scenario or operator connect scenario. What Jason is saying is just a little bit more cumbersome to configure, right? And then manage ongoing.
Right.
But from a calling plan perspective, right, we can, like, that registered address, right, and dynamic E911 is just included as part of that calling plan.
So the dynamic E11 works for a caller who's at home or at the local coffee shop down the street, as long as their device they're on has this dynamic location turned on. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, correct. And then even in the case where they may, so for example, trying to think of a good example here, where they might have a registered address, right? And let's say they don't have location services enabled on an iOS device or an Android device.
Sure.
Then there will be a, and I'm not sure what this looks like from a tenant perspective, because I've never really tested this, or from an application perspective, sorry. It will essentially, right, you make the emergency call. Is this, right, this is the address you're registered at. Are you at this address? And gives you an option to change that, right? So that, for example, I've got a calling policy, right, assigned to me that says I'm supposed to be in an office, but I'm remote. And it will verify, right, because it for one reason or another, right, it's saying, hey, are you at the registered address, or can you provide your updated address? And I'm actually not exactly sure what that looks like from a Teams client perspective, but I'll have to do a little bit of work there, maybe follow up with you and show you what that looks like.
That would be something we would be very interested in knowing. That would be very helpful.
Sure. All right, Rod, we'll take your information down and get back to you.
Thank you, Rod.
Thank you very
Next,
much.
we have Suhas.
Hi, Sohas.
Hello. I hope you guys can hear me.
Yes.
So I hear loud and clear that Microsoft calling plans are the easy button. Unfortunately, we cannot click that easy button for multiple good reasons. So we hear multiple times saying that, but that's something we can do. So on the direct routing, we are basically, I hear that we have to do something, but that something is always a kind of fuzzy kind of the scenario, right? What as a customer, what do I need to do to get compliance quickly is the question. So I don't know if this is the right forum or not, but that's where we are a little puzzled, because it seems like there are only few ERS service providers. So how do we make that happen? And how can Microsoft help us get there?
Yeah, so I think what we'll probably want to do is follow up with you with some documentation on direct routing that's specific, right? So the first things first, right? We have to, because we don't have a registered emergency address, right? That capability isn't available to us with direct routing, right? We have to actually register our own addresses, right? And we do that through a combination of the Microsoft Teams Admin Console and your SBC of choice. I'm not sure what you're using. And then in order to accommodate for dynamic E911, right, you've got to have a relationship with a service provider. And I don't know if that list has been updated, Suhas. I'm not sure. I haven't looked at it for a while on the available partners from a dynamic E911 perspective.
So who is Microsoft's ERS service provider?
Great question. I don't know that. Do you know offhand, Jason? Helen?
I don't. Yeah, that was a good question. I don't know offhand.
Let's take that one down. We can get you an answer.
Yeah, I can provide more information, some links for you, Suhas.
Yeah, and can we tap into the follow-up question on that is, can we tap into the same kind of the mechanism of kind of when the user dials 911, I kind of tap into the same mechanism or same provider you guys have, is the question.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Ellen, if you don't mind, take that down, and then looks like you're already doing it. So
I actually have a link for you, Suhas, that you can use in the meantime.
great questions. Thanks,
Yeah.
Suhas.
And
Yeah.
sorry, one other thing is, it seems like that you said chat will be available. We cannot chat, by the way. Just that if you guys notice that or not, chat has been disabled.
Gotcha. I'll email it over to you. We'll take down your information and email it over.
Thank you.
Awesome. Next question we have from Patrick. Patrick, feel
He's
free
still
to
on mute.
unmute.
So let's unmute him.
Sorry,
go.
guys. Hey, thanks for setting this up. We appreciate it. My question is, looking at the documentation, it states that really the only two areas where the client would actually be directed, an emergency call would be directly to the PSAP, would be if it's dynamically acquired by Liz, or if it's if the emergency address is obtained by the operating system using location services with confirmation for accuracy by the user. All other scenarios of how the address is assigned are automatically sent to the call center and then transferred over to PSAP. And I was going to ask, is that part of Kari and Baum's law? I mean, is that acceptable? Is that?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question, and actually kind of clarifies an earlier question, right? So if it's a registered emergency address, it's not dynamically verified, right? And so there's got to be a mechanism in place to say, hey, because this is a registered emergency address, we're not sure you're there, right? Physically there. So it can't go directly to the PSAP at that point. It needs to go through the intermediary, right? To verify, hey, are you actually at your registered emergency address or not? And I'm not an attorney by trade. In fact, reading through 66 pages to get, 3 clarifying bullets is pretty painful. Fortunately, I haven't had to read through all 66 pages, but I think your question addresses that need, right? So if I haven't dynamically captured your address location, I'm not guaranteed that the registered emergency address, right, that's given to you via policy through either the site level or user level, I'm not sure you're physically there, right? And so then it would have to hit an intermediary to verify, are you at the address that we were given? No, I'm at this address. And then it gets forwarded to a PSAP in that particular area, region, what have you. Make sense?
It does. I'm curious if it's okay to send these calls to the call center to be screened. Then, and that meets Kari and Baum's Act. I'm not sure. Should we even be concerned with this? Because it seems like certain scenarios. I mean, that's what's going to happen anyway, right?
Yeah.
So again, there's only 2 scenarios, at least based on the documentation. There's only 2 scenarios where the call will go to PSAP.
Right. And so in the US, right, there's that difference where if we acquire the address dynamically, then you'll go straight to the PSAP, which offloads calls to the intermediary, right? In other countries, for example, Canada, the UK, most of the Zone 8 countries outside that where we offer calling plans, they don't automatically route to the PSAP, right? They will intercept that call every time to verify where are you physically, regardless of the registered emergency address. I think in the US, they've written the automatically that process of automatically forwarding to the PSAP to offload right from an emergency services routing perspective. And quite frankly, at the end of the day, right, it's only when we can dynamically, right, there's a high probability when we dynamically acquire that location, there's a high probability right? That person's physically there.
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to call out and see if sending the call directly to the call center is does that meet Kari and Baum's Act? I'm just curious.
I think it does, right? Especially in those cases when you have a registered emergency address.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, sure thing.
All right, last question I have is Kurt.
Yeah, my scenario is the same that you were just talking about, same as Rod's as well. But we have internal resources that we use a VPN client for, and tons of remote workers that are accessing VPN. So when setting up the call, and by the way, we're using call-in plans, just to clarify. So using call-in plans, assigning the telephone number, assigning the emergency address at the time the telephone number is created. But in that scenario where we're connecting over VPN, we don't offload that traffic. It goes straight through the data center and then back out. So in that case, it may misinterpret that user's location.
Yep.
So that's from what I've heard on this call as well. A few other people are struggled with how to set this thing up or how does it properly function. And for us, like one scenario would be if a user is physically sitting at their desk at the assigned address that they have their telephone number, they take their laptop using Teams desktop client. They go, they hop in the trunk with you, Chad, and head on down the road. It's just being able to appropriately determine that user's location, in any scenario. So if.
Yeah, Kurt, no, that's another scenario that we run into quite a bit, unfortunately. In fact, the customer that I was talking about before, we had to go through some lengthy discussions on why you would split tunnel, right? So the idea is that, your Microsoft 365, your relationship with Microsoft, right, from a contractual perspective, it's a trusted service provider. So why not, right, split tunnel and allow that traffic to go directly to the Microsoft cloud, the Azure network at the end of the day? It's there's a lot of benefits, and it's actually, based on our guidance with regards to best practice, right? So any Microsoft 365 traffic, split tunnel your VPN, right, and send it directly to the Azure network so that we're backhauling the traffic, number one, right? And from a performance and reliability perspective, especially when it comes to media like video and voice, you're guaranteed the best end user experience. If you split tunnel, right, then you won't have the problem with regards to location, because the dynamic E911 capability will kick in, right, and understand that user is not at the registered emergency address. So there's like three, I guess I just mentioned three examples of and benefits to split tunneling. You could start with just the team service if you wanted to, but typically, I'd say, gosh, probably 80% of the customers that I work with are already split tunneling their M365 traffic regardless of service. But the other 20%, we have to kind of talk to them about why you would, the benefits, right? And then what's kind of the impact to your organization, right? At the end of the day, if you choose to do that, there's some impact, right? From a configuration, from a networking kind of architectural perspective. Not to mention if you're doing any kind of port sniffing, right, from a proxy perspective, and you want to preserve that, right? Then how do we do that through the M365 service, as opposed to, proxies at the edge?
So when you set up that telephone number, you're required to assign that emergency address at that time.
So in the case of, you said you had calling plans?
Yeah, calling plans. So there's
Yeah, so-
more to that. So
Okay.
when you set up that telephone number, you're required to assign that emergency address.
Mhm.
And from what I'm hearing, and regardless if your accurate location can be determined or not, you're still in compliance because you have a location assigned to that telephone number. You're still in compliance with these laws.
Yeah, so a registered emergency address would be, if I'm understanding your question right, like a site, a building, a floor, a potential cubicle, right, office. And then, right, when you're outside the so let's say you've done that, right? They're connecting through VPN. So the emergency call is still thinking, well, they're on site, right? Because they're connected through VPN, which is an IP address that I trust as part of a building site location, right? But when I'm not connected for that service through VPN, right, I'm getting a dynamic E911 location assigned that's different than my registered emergency address because it doesn't recognize the IP, right, of that specific site, building, floor, etc. Does that help?
Yeah,
Get off.
that helps. So I mean, really, it's regardless if there's any scenario where your location is different from the what that location is set at for the emergency address based on what's attached to that telephone number, it really doesn't matter because you're still in compliance, even though your location may not be reporting accurately when you place the call.
Right.
But you're still in compliance, is what you're saying, right?
From the way that I understand and what we're required to do from an implementation perspective to accommodate for that scenario, right? Again, I'm not an attorney. I'm not the guy that wrote the law, so don't depend on on exactly what I say. But I think from an implementation perspective, you look back at those bullet points at the earlier part of the presentation. If you've implemented for that, you're good to go.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Kurt. George, feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, not to beat a dead horse, but the one thing that we need is a statement from Microsoft that says whether this screening process, when it occurs, we have all these other things in place, but when that occurs, does that meet these laws or not? Otherwise, the Attorney General of the state of Maryland is going to decide for us, and they may not rule in your favor.
Yeah, and I was a little reluctant to. I knew this conversation would lead to a lot of like, hey, give me a guarantee, right? But much like back in the days of HIPAA, right, before you could just throw everything in a Microsoft cloud or a certified cloud and be okay from a HIPAA perspective, right? When they came in to audit, they would look for specific implementation, right, in accordance with the law or the regulations requirements. And in this case, right, I think the three requirements from a Kari's Law, Ray Baum's Act perspective are those first three bullet points. And have we implemented, right, for those three things? If you use calling plans or you use Operator Connect or you use...
And honestly, you don't have to go through it again. But, if you're not able to give us, that assurance, which you're not, and that's okay, how can we get that? We need to get that from somewhere that says, yes, this is or not. And I would imagine that's going to be the same for every customer you have across the country is going to have the same issue. So somebody has to know. I mean, you must have designed it that way. Our assumption was that you built it this way knowing this law was coming, so it must be compliant, but we need more than that.
And we sure did, we sure did, George, right? So if you think back to Patrick's question, I think, hey, calling plans, all great and good, right? Kind of just report a number and we're off and running. Awesome. But what about, this situation where I do use direct routing and I have a registered address and somebody's actually connecting, right, and experiencing or placing an emergency call and they're not physically at that address? What are kind of the fail safes? And that fail safe is to say, hey, we're not gonna send you directly to the PSAP because there's no guarantee, right, that you're at that registered address. We're gonna actually send you to an emergency response call center. And actually, as Scott Moore, one of our counterparts from a Teams TS perspective, called out in the chat, when you place calls to an emergency response center like that, your organization is actually charged, right, per encounter. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, granted, 911, hopefully, right, we're not making too many emergency calls from any organization, but I think that's part of the reason, right, to automatically send it to the PSAP. If you're relatively certain, right, that E911 address that was, is identifying that user, right, or that device that the user's using, you negate some of those charges. So.
Right. So is that something you could get back to us with or point us in the right direction? Where we can get a definitive answer on that.
Well, I think the answer is if you correct me if I'm wrong, guys. Maybe I'm not hearing it right, but George, I'm just saying if you're using calling plans, right, you're kind of good to go. If you're using Operator Connect, there's a few things you need to do from an organizational perspective to implement, right, so that you comply with what's in the law, right? And if you're using direct routing, you've got to do a little bit more.
Right. Yeah, I hear you, and I agree, but we need more. But
So
thank you,
Michael. You have your
point taken. Thank you, George.
I just want to interject one quick piece, and George, we do hear this a lot with other areas too that are around legal and compliance, and with many things, there is ways to get sign-offs. However, this is number one, we provide a service, and the service, if implemented according to best practices and our prescriptive guidance and how to lay out, then when we say it meets this particular requirement, it meets that, and then there are things that you can do around that. However, most customers, and the one, like a great example was brought up earlier, not split tunneling, right? Traffic not showing, somebody's mobile, they're VPN'd in, and it's showing here. There are many configurations oftentimes where customers can do things. The service may be compliant, but your implementation may not meet the needs to make that compliant. So that's why we don't just give a thing, hey, if you've implemented our stuff, throw it out there. We guarantee what is done, however, is when you implement, if that's a concern that your organization has around having somebody indemnified and on the hook for it, that's typically services, right? So they're ensuring that you implement according to something, they're signed off, and if there's an issue, they're on the hook, and they're, the throat to choke, the legal route or whatever. But that's how that's done, because anytime you have something that's not just a straightforward to pick up the phone works, but it's where are things being routed, how are they being routed, et cetera, we get into implementation. And so implementation can have huge ramifications on a guarantee. And so then if you have a need, if your org, because to be blunt, not all orgs ask us for that. They work with their legal group. What do they feel comfortable with? Are they implementing in accordance? And then they're good. But we do have customers, like you mentioned, who do ask for that. And that's typically through service engagement, because that can all be part of a contract. And I'll shut up.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael.
My question is really specific to the call screening process. You know, I get that we can configure all the dynamic stuff 100 different ways, but specifically this call screening process, since it's the lowest common denominator, is that itself compliant for someone to dial 911, talk to Microsoft first, and then get sent to a PSAP? Or does the law require the call to go directly to the PSAP to be compliant? So that's really my question. And, you know, if you're able to help us figure that out offline, great. You know, if not, we'll try and figure out another way to do it.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
no, George, we'll definitely touch base, or at least take your information down and see if we can, you know, help locate the account
Clear.
team and
Yeah.
and get the right folks in line to kind of say, hey, here's my specific need, right? And then we'll accommodate for it.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And in closing, it's really up to the organization to really determine their business needs, as every industry is a little different, have different requirements, have different levels of responsibility. But always consult with your legal team and your legal department so that you know if you are compliant or not.
Few different resources I just wanted to call out here at the end. The Coffee in the Cloud Microsoft Teams Dynamic Emergency Calling. It's on YouTube. That's the hyperlink there. Actually, you can throw it in the chat for you, for most of you. And that's about 2 years old, but it's a really good representation of what we've kind of covered here from a very kind of a high level. We tried to make this as succinct as possible. It's 2 years old, but it's still pretty relevant. It's about an hour long. You watch it at 1.75 or 1.5 speed. It makes it quite a bit quicker.
Yeah.
So if you want to take a look at that, that's a good one. And then I know it was asked a little bit earlier, and I think Scott jumped in there with 3 certified partners around emergency routing providers and ELIN gateways. And then obviously, you know, folks like Intrado Bandwidth and IntelliQuint, they're part of those references as well.
All right. Thank you everyone so much for attending today. It was a pleasure, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Yeah, and for those who attended today, I just want to first of all thank our host and our guest presenters today. And for the rest of you who are still on the call, be on the lookout. I'm going to be posting probably tomorrow the link for ongoing sessions and what we're going to do then. Instead of you having to go in each time, and I can do things a little different and ensure that everybody can chat, I'm going to do a recurring link for all of our MidDay Cafe live sessions. That way you'll have one link, you add it to your calendar, and you're done. And you attend when you can. Don't worry when you can't. And we'll have that out for everybody, make it much simpler. I'll still be posting the LinkedIn individual, but those will all reference the same link. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for attending today. And thank you for a lively chat and discussion. This is great. And with that, have a great day, rest of your Monday. Take care, people. Bye-bye now.